Hi, my name is Christy Illascas. My preferred pronouns are she, her, ella. I identify as Mexican American and Indigenous, specifically Zapotec. My family is from Oaxaca, Mexico, but specifically from Villa Hidalgo y Alala in the northern Sierra of the state. I speak both English and Spanish, as well as French, and I understand Zapotec. This is what looking bilingual means to me.
You identify as Mexican American and Indigenous. So, can you tell us more about your family and your roots?
Both my parents are both from the state of Oaxaca, and they happen to both be from the same pueblo, which is Yalala. Both my parents, growing up, always spoke Zapotec in the house, which was something that I knew early on was different from other like Mexican kids. Like at least when we would talk about it in school. That's just something that I knew. Wait a second. Why are my parents speaking another language? As I got older, that's when I got into baile folclórico, and that's something that my cousins, myself, and other extended family would do. And so that's where I learned dance, and dance is a big part of our my identity. Jarabes specifically, jarabes are a dance and music that in any celebration you can definitely see. Those two elements were something very prevalent about my roots as being Zapotec.
How would you describe to a friend the core differences between Mexican and Oaxacan?
Oaxacan culture a little bit different from the Mexican culture. I
Mhm.
think Mexican culture is beautiful in itself, and the most beautiful thing about it is that it can really get into many different aspects. But Los Angeles has a big Oaxacan community. We have been recognized as also being known as Oaxaca, California, because like our Oaxacan elders have immigrated to California. So there's in fact a lot more Oaxacan specifically from Zapotec people who are in California and their children are here. So me being a child of Oaxacan people, I would say that like the festivities, Guelaguetza, a festival that happens in Oaxaca, in which all of the regions, so in Oaxaca there's 8 regions, and all of those regions come together and celebrate the dances, the music, and the food that all of that's unique to those regions. That's usually a month-long festival that happens in Oaxaca, but in Los Angeles there's like a mini version of it in which we have and host in August. And before the Guelaguetza festival, which is usually a whole weekend, there's a parade, or it's known as a calenda, and this is when the different folklorico groups in Los Angeles, they come together for this parade and they dress in their huipil, in their traditional Oaxacan vestuarios, and they walk for a mile. Additionally, something that really stands out to me is something we call kermeses. So kermeses are what we would call like fundraisers, but the fundraisers are designed in a way where it's food being the central aspect, but also dance. So again, bringing those dances from the pueblo into the kermeses, and you see like the children, young teens, they do this on their own for because that's part of identity and that's something that they are interested in. They practice for weeks and then they perform at kermeses.
Food and dance, what better way to maintain contact with your cultures? What was it like coming to the East Coast? Because your perception of Latinidad is very different. And so coming here must have been like a Latinidad culture shock. Can you explain what maybe the biggest challenges were for you when you came over here for university?
Specifically coming from Los Angeles, where most of the Latinx community is prominently Mexican or Central American. Going out to the East Coast where the Latinidad is Caribbean, it was definitely a culture shock because that's all I knew. Being in Lancaster, Pennsylvania specifically, where I spent 4 years, I wouldn't say that it was much of a challenge as much as as a learning experience. And in fact, something I thoroughly enjoyed being away from what I knew was familiar. Although it was initially a little bit daunting, the histories of Puerto Rican and Dominican people was very much related at the core of everything through colonization. The history was something that I remember really wanting to learn more about, and also prompted me to learn more about my own history at the core of what it means to be Indigenous, specifically being Zapotec, because there's so much I still don't know. It was something that I needed to be exposed to, and to absorb and to learn from the community in Lancaster. It was one of my favorite parts of being away from home.
Something that one of my past interviewees said was that you really start to see the edges. You're starting to see where you overlap, where you differ. Some people like to just call us Latinos and that's the end of the story. You know, we're not a monolith, but we do share things in common, right? Which is why, you know, those things that we find that we're like, oh, me too, or they used to tell me that story too when I was growing up, or that song, you know, we have a slightly different version, or even vocabulary. And so it must have been really cool to see like, oh, this is similar, this is very different. Oh, this makes me wonder more about this part of me. Like you said, we could really dig deep into Latinidad and see how similar we are and those things we share, or how they have adjusted to us culturally, and then the things that are super different. I mean, I agree with you. Like, you know, for me, it's such a beautiful part of being part of this community, but having such specific stories and such specific traditions that we continue to carry on. The more I've been thinking about your story and everything you've shared with me, is I would love to have that kind of knowledge about my family's roots back on, you know, in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. It's very inspiring to hear you tell your story and also the traditions that you all carry forward. And can you talk a little bit more about Zapoteca?
Yes, of course. So Zapotec is a group of indigenous peoples in Oaxaca. Oaxaca is a primarily indigenous state, so it has, if not the most indigenous group of people in the country of Mexico, Yucatan being second. But in Oaxaca, there's several indigenous communities. Zapotec is also a language. There are several areas in Oaxaca where it's spoken, one being the La Sierra Norte, or the Northern Sierra of Oaxaca. But in every pueblo in Oaxaca, every city has its own version of Zapotec. And I myself understand Zapotec, but don't speak it.
And I remember you telling me, you know, something you recognize, especially when you came over here and you were studying French. Can you share a little bit more about that?
I felt a sense of guilt in the sense that I learned French, but not necessarily give that same energy and curiosity towards Zapotec. And even to this day, there's a bit of guilt where I'm like, why don't I speak Zapotec like I speak French? My parents would encourage us to respond in Spanish growing up. So even, or they would speak to us primarily in Spanish. But despite that, I would say that because my parents still speak the language at home pretty much every day, I understand what they're saying, even though they may think I don't get, I don't understand, but I do. One of my grandmothers doesn't speak Spanish. She only speaks Zapotec. She also was an integral part of like how I'm able to encompass the language and learn the language, understanding it, not necessarily speaking it. I really had to find a way to communicate, even if she didn't know Spanish. Right. I didn't know Zapotec.
I think I've heard a term for that, receptive bilingualism, where you understand but you can't necessarily respond. That's still a level of bilingualism, or, you know, multilingualism in your case. You painted this beautiful picture of your grandmother's house. Can you share a little bit?
We would take trips to Oaxaca periodically every couple years and during the summertime to visit our grandparents. I unfortunately did not meet both my grandfathers on both sides of my family. However, I did meet and I did have the privilege of enjoying my grandmothers. Specifically, my grandmother Lupe, who I mentioned, doesn't speak Spanish and I don't speak Zapotec. Lupe didn't go to school as a child, so that's why she didn't learn Spanish. She would walk barefoot around the house. Like she would wear huipil dress, which is our traditional dress, every day. She was very much rooted in her indigenous identity. Her bedroom, I remember, we would sleep on matetes. So in Oaxaca, we have something called matete. So these are like mats that were made out of straw. They're still used to this day, and we would sleep on those. That's how I knew this is where we come from. I remember when she would make me breakfast, she would speak to me in Zapotec, like, do you want coffee? Do you want tortillas with beans? And I remember just doing my best to communicate, and she understood. I have I'll share with you an image of her feeding her chickens.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would go with her, walking down the stairs, because her home was all outside. So like the rooms were separated, but like you would have to go outside to go to each room. Spending time with my grandma, even though we didn't speak the same language, sitting down right in front of her house is like all the mountains, so you can see everything, and we would just sit, and it would be quiet because there was not much to talk about since we couldn't speak each other's language, but just sharing the intimate moment of having ciruelas, for example, was something that I remember very fondly of her.
Oh, girl, how fortunate to like have that image and that experience and to have lived that, to really see where you come from and to really have enjoyed it and also to appreciate it. You've been kind enough to agree to share a very important poem that you wrote. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and then share it with us?
I wrote a poem during my time at Franklin and Marshall. And this is a poem I wrote. Actually, I wrote it originally in Los Angeles, but I remember really rewriting it again in F&M. Around this time, I was really homesick. I missed my people, I missed my music, I missed the food, and I missed my family. So this was just a beautiful way to capture that homesickness. But also, at the time, I was going through an identity crisis of like, where do I stand? Like, it was hard to identify as Mexican American because I felt like that wasn't all of what I was. But I also didn't quite feel empowered to call myself Indigenous, and specifically Zapotec, because I felt so alienated from my community and from the geographical space. And I thought that this was a perfect way to bring all these conflicting emotions together and turn it into poetry. So this poem is titled Palabras de tu lengua madre. Look at yourself in the mirror. Morena, Zapoteca, y Indígena is what you'll always be. No matter how hard you try to scrape off the Yalalteca de tu sangre, your roots will always rise up to embrace your soul. Don't walk away in shame from Mami cuando habla Zapoteco. Instead, run into her arms until her words brand your skin. Whoever told you your language was not welcomed here, just like your mother, father, brother, sister have been for generations, clearly carries their tongue in a single voice, unable to handle the many meanings of the world, like the many ways to say I love you, te quiero, je n'aure. Wrap your body, tu cuerpo mojado, with the huipil your abuelita made with her strong and worn out hands. The hands that have always pressed on the molcajete. The hands that have always clapped side to side for las tortillas. For all that has fed your soul before you were born. Baila, baila esos jarabes, zapateando back to your patria, adorned with magic, magic that transformed into these handmade, con mucho amor vestidos, you hope will never become culturally appropriated. Whoever told you, indigenous child, to fix your tongue? Remember that your language will always protect your secrets, the way your mommy has since the day you were born. Look at yourself in the mirror because Morena, Zapoteca, y Indígena is what you'll always be.